Hello everybody. Sorry I'm a few minutes late. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Just going to give some time for people to join us, and then we'll get right into our conversation of talking about the Truman family today. So we'll just give it another minute or so, and then we'll jump right in. Alright, hi everybody. Welcome to the Phelps Mansion. My name is Joe, and I am going to be doing our Facebook Live event today. We're going to be talking about the Truman family. The Trumans were the third and final family to live in the mansion. This event, like many others that we've been doing since the museum is closed, is just a way for us to continue engaging with our supporters and just sharing a little bit more about the history of our house. So we appreciate you coming today and watching from afar. Hope everybody's doing well, and we'll be able to get out sometime this weekend and enjoy the beautiful weather that we're going to have here as well. So just for those of you who are joining us, if you're not familiar with the history of the house, this house was built in 1870 for Sherman David Phelps and his two sons and his niece, Sarah. Mr. Phelps's wife, his second wife, had died before this house was completed, so he lived here with his two boys and the niece, Sarah. Unfortunately, Mr. Phelps only lived in his brand new home for about 7 years. He died in 1878 when he was 64 years old. 2 years later, his youngest son died. He was 21 years old. His name was Arthur. The very next year, Robert passed away. He was 26 years old. And then the very next year, Robert's wife, Hattie, whose portrait's right here behind me, passed away, also at the age of 26 years old. At that point, there were no immediate heirs to this line of the family, so the house was left to Sherman's nieces and nephews, who held the deed to the house and acquired a lot of the family's belongings. Eventually they did elect to sell the house. In 1888, it was sold to George Harry Lester of the Leicestershire Boot Company. He didn't live here very long. He only owned the house for about a year, and in fact, he may not have even lived in the house. He may have just owned it, made some improvements, fixed things up, but in 1889, he ended up losing the house after some business deals had gone poorly, and he ended up losing a lot of money and losing the house. At that point, the house was then rented to the Truman family, and the Trumans would live here between the years of 1889 and sometime in the 1900s. Could be 1904, could be 1905. The records are kind of all over the place with dates, but according to James Truman's daughter, they were here between 1889 and 1905. When they left, that's when the Monday Afternoon Club bought the house, and ever since then, it was a private clubhouse until becoming a museum in 2005. So I'm here by myself, so I'm gonna try to talk to you guys a little bit about the Trumans, but also we'll just take a walk around the house too. So if you're new to joining us, you can also see some of the mansion as well while we're talking. If you have any questions or comments, or if there's something you want to see closer that I am not showing, but we want to see, just let me know, and I'll be more than happy to get a closer shot for you. So with that being said, we'll start talking about James C. Truman. So Mr. Truman was born in 1841 to Nathan and Loretta Truman. Nathan and Loretta had 5 children. They lived in Butternuts, a little town called Butternuts, which was also known as Truman Hill, and this is in Otsego County. James was educated at Gilbertsville Academy and also attended a college institute in his town as well. Mr. Truman, at the age of 17 years old, began teaching school, and he did that for about 3 years. So imagine he was 17 years old, teaching school, but when he turned 20 years old, he began working in an office by the name of Abram Becker. And Mr. Becker was a lawyer in South Worcester, New York, and it said that Mr. Truman read law there. In 1863, Mr. Truman married his wife, Serena Wilbur, and that same year, he actually went to California, where he founded Truman and Company Express, which was later known as Pacific Press, and then eventually consolidated with Wells Fargo and Company. In 1865, Mr. Truman returned from California and began a mercantile business in Gilbertsville, New York. And he also served as postmaster there, and he held other offices in the town of Gilbertsville as well. So that's kind of an introduction to Mr. Truman and his family. Mr. and Mrs. Truman would eventually have 6 kids, and we'll talk a little bit more about the children and his family as we move on. So if there aren't any questions, we'll keep moving, but before we do, I'll just kind of pan around our parlor here, so those of you who may be joining us and have never seen this room can get a little bit of a glimpse. Museums fall under the category of Phase 4 here in New York State, so we're looking at probably an opening date of sometime around the beginning of July, unless the governor moves to Phase 4 sooner. So we hope that when we do reopen, that you will come and visit us, and then you can see the house in person. So we're going to move to the back parlor here. During his time in Gilbertsville, Mr. Truman and Serena suffered some devastating loss. They lost 2 of their sons, James, who was born in 1864, and Nathan, who was born in 1865. James had died just a little before he had turned 4 years old, and Nathan passed away when he was 3 years old. Truman and his wife obviously were deeply affected by the passing of their 2 children. Both of the boys are buried in Brookside Cemetery in Gilbertsville. Truman actually had created an association to improve and care for the cemetery where his 2 youngest children are buried. Now, the Trumans had 4 other children. James, born in 1868. Benjamin, who was born in 1870. However, Benjamin died shortly after birth. And Cleveland was born in 1872. And Serena, the daughter, was born in 1880. Now, in 1869, Truman went to Culpeper, Virginia, and he began to get involved with real estate there. He also dealt in real estate in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. And then in 1870, he went to Chicago, But unfortunately, in 1871, like many other people in Chicago, Mr. Truman lost everything in the Great Chicago Fire. So that was a pretty devastating loss for him. Just moving to Chicago and only being there a year and then losing everything. So it was at that point that he returned to Binghamton and he began engaging in produce trade. But eventually he found even more success as publisher and owner of the Binghamton Daily Times. During this time of Truman's life, he was selected by San Francisco and Binghamton businessmen who wanted to build a road to connect express lines through Southern California, Arizona, and New Mexico. The project never really came to fruition because they ran into many hostilities with the Native Americans who were in those areas. And so the road that they were looking to build never really happened, and everyone involved in that project suffered huge financial losses because of the project not being able to be completed. So we are about 1870 now, so James would be about 29, 30 years old at this point. We did have some questions as to whether or not he would have served in the Civil War, but I couldn't find any records indicating any kind of service during that time. He was in California during the Civil War, so I don't know. That'll be more research that we'll have to conduct later on. So moving into the main part of the hall here, you can see the beautiful woodwork throughout the house. This is all walnut out here. Got a beautiful grand staircase as well. They say it cost about $5,000 to build this staircase. There was another staircase that ran to the second floor, and that one was also $5,000, so $10,000 for the whole staircase. So I'll move you guys to the front room here. Now, when Mr. Truman returned to Binghamton, he became very involved with politics in the city. He was actually head of the Democratic organization in Broome County for many years. In 1884, 1885, he was appointed by Governor Grover Cleveland to represent New York at the World's Fair the World's Exposition in New Orleans. He did represent the state with great success. Unfortunately, it was also during his time in New Orleans that he contracted malaria, which almost cost him his life. However, he did recover and accepted a position to work in the United States Treasury, where he stayed until his appointment as postmaster of Binghamton, which occurred in 1888 to 1889. Now, his time as postmaster was short-lived because when Benjamin Harrison became president, Truman was replaced by a Republican successor. So at this point, Truman found himself without work. So he went back to the real estate business and began working real estate in New York City. And he was also a founder of Nepera Park in Yonkers, New York, which his plans for that park, for that part of land, was to develop like a little suburb outside the city. His son, James, was also engaged in real estate in Yonkers, and his other son, Cleveland, the younger son, was a registered clerk and working in the post office here in Binghamton. So, does anybody have any questions or anything about anything that we've talked about so far? For a long time, we always talk about the Phelps family and the Monday afternoon club. So we thought it would be nice to share a little bit about the history of the Trumans as well. For a long time, we didn't really know much about the Truman family, just a little bit about them, but we were able to find some really great information, and also a picture. If you happen to go back later and look at the event page, you'll see a picture of James C. Truman, his daughter Serena, and her husband Edgar Monroe Robinson, who we'll talk about in a little bit. So, all right, we'll keep moving to the dining room here. You can see we're in the beautiful dining room here. It's all oak woodwork. This was the formal dining room of the house. The wallpaper that you're seeing over in the corner there is not original. It was put up in the 1970s. So, in addition to Truman being dabbling a little bit of everything, he was also an extensive traveler. He crossed the American continent 15 times, and at one point in his life he spent 10 weeks traveling all across Europe. He spent time in Gibraltar, Algiers, the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. He was in Italy. He visited the volcano of Stromboli, Alexandria, Cairo, where he saw the pyramids of Egypt. He also spent time in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and he visited the Dead Sea, the Black Sea, and Constantinople. So he loved to travel, and you can clearly see that in just that short list. That was a lot of places to visit in 10 weeks' time. Now in 1895, Mr. Truman purchased a large farm in Yonkers, New York called Valley Farm. This property once belonged to William Tweed, also known as Boss Tweed, Big Boss Tweed. Big Boss Tweed was head of the, one of the political machines in New York City, and had a lot of power. But when Mr. Tweed passed away, the farm was sold to another gentleman who then in 1895 sells the land and the farm to Mr. Truman. The farm was huge. It was 1,000 acres. It was 2.5 miles long, and it was about 0.5 mile in width. And this property would be a property that when James Truman retires, that's where he was going to go and live. So around 1904 and 1905, the Truman family did move to Yonkers, and that's when the mansion was put up for sale again. Unfortunately, Mr. Truman never got to actually enjoy his new farm in Yonkers because he passed away a year later in 1906. His wife Serena passed away in 1914. And the Trumans are buried in a plot there at Mount Hope Cemetery, which is in the town of Hastings-on-Hudson in Westchester County. Now, in digging into the ancestry of the family, we kind of were curious to see, well, what happened to the other children, James and Cleveland and Serena, the 3 surviving children of the 6. James did marry a young lady named Christine Mangum, and they had 2 children, Martha and Stuart. Cleveland married Grace Smith in Sydney, New York in January of 1893. He died in 1894. It was a very unexpected passing. It left Mr. and Mrs. Truman devastated. Cleveland and Grace had no children. And actually I found an interesting newspaper article relating to Cleveland and Grace's marriage. They had their wedding secretly. Neither of the parents knew about this marriage. They were married in January of 1893, but eventually the parents found out. They actually found out in June. So about 5 months later, they found out that Cleveland and Grace had been married secretly, and the Trumans insisted that they remarry and have a proper ceremony. So they were remarried in June of 1893. So they're actually married twice in the same year. They had two wedding ceremonies. Now Serena, the youngest daughter, she eventually married Edgar Robinson. They had 4 children, according to an obituary that was from hers in 1967. Now 3 of those children were actually from Edgar's previous marriage. So Serena and Edgar had 1 child between the 2 of them. But according to the obituary, she loved them all the same, as if they were her own kids. So an interesting thing about Edgar Robinson was he was actually associated with the YMCA. He served as chairman of the Boys' Work Committee and later developed their first camping program. In 1898, he was hired as the Boys' Work Secretary by the Massachusetts Rhode Island State Committee. While he was working in for the YMCA in Massachusetts, he also attended something called the YMCA Training School, which now is known as Springfield College. He was appointed Boys' Work Secretary of the International Committee in 1900. At this time, there were 20 Boys' Work Secretaries and 30,000 boys as members nationwide. 13 years later, they had grown to about 363 secretaries and had over 120,000 youth amongst the membership of the YMCA. Edgar Robinson developed camping programs, father and son programs. She specialized work with employed boys and also during wartime programs. In 1908 and 1909, Boy Scout troops were starting to pop up in different locations across the United States. This is before the Boy Scouts of America existed. So following the publication of Scouting for Boys by Robert Baden-Powell, a handful of YMCA centers were hosting these troops. So it can be said that Edgar Robinson helped get the Boy Scouts of America off the ground so that his organization and others would have resources to give to the troop leaders. In 1910, Edgar Robinson was appointed managing director of the Boy Scouts of America, which he served for a limited time. He then relinquished his role and began doing some other work. His work, though, was recognized by the Boy Scouts of America with the Silver Buffalo Award in 1926, and Mr. Robinson had remained a very important figure in the YMCA boys' work until he retired in 1927. And in 2000, he was actually inducted into the YMCA Hall of Fame at Springfield College. So if you get a chance to go back to the event page after we're done here, you can see Mr. and Mrs. Robinson's pictures. His picture, Edgar's picture, was from an old yearbook that dates to around 1900, and Serena's picture was actually from her passport when she was traveling. So let's see how we're doing on time here. Okay, good. So before we do anything else, we'll just take another peek around. In 1962, when the house was owned by the Monday Afternoon Club, Serena Truman came back. They were living in Massachusetts, in Springfield, Massachusetts. She came back to Binghamton. One of her daughters actually drove her back to Binghamton, and she made time to visit the house, and the Monday Afternoon Club wanted to kind of ask her questions about their time here in the mansion, and they had some questions about where certain things might have come from, and if they were here when the family moved in, or if the family added them later. So Serena was able to help figure out some of those things. But remember, she was only about 9 years old when she first moved into the house. So how much she might have remembered initially is up for debate. But she did write a letter back after her visit, which, she passed away in 1967, so we're talking 5 years before she passed away. And we still have that letter in our collection today. So I actually have a copy of the letter in my pocket, and I was going to read it to you guys. But she talks about, when families buy a new home, they might use certain rooms of the house for different purposes than, say, like the Phelpses might have done. So, she talks about entertaining in the entertaining space on the third floor of the house, which we know that the Phelpses had a billiards room up there, but it is possible that maybe the Trumans used it as a small ballroom or entertaining space and not necessarily a billiards room. She talked about this conservatory here being filled with plants. There was always a fountain in the room. Her older brother, Cleveland, loved to play tennis. So right outside these windows, where we have a parking lot out there today that's doesn't belong to the museum, but belongs to the business across the street, there were tennis courts out there. So Cleveland could play tennis. And then off to the back of the lot, I know it's hard to see through these curtains, but the curtains are not easily moved. You can kind of see there's trees back there. To the right of those trees, there was a carriage house or a stable house. So the tennis courts kind of bumped up against the carriage house. You see this picture right here. The building to the left is the carriage house. And that's Fayette Street there. You can see the old trolley tracks. And the two buildings across the street on the right, those are still there. So the carriage house was taken down around 1904. So probably just around the time, shortly after the time that the Trumans might have left to move to Yonkers, the carriage house came down. So the house was sold to J.S. Wells. J.S. Wells was the original contractor, working closely with Isaac Perry to have this house built. In 1870, he acquires it, and then he ends up, selling it to the Monday Afternoon Club in 1905. There was an old newspaper article that we found in doing some research on the Truman family that said that he bought the house in 1905 for about $25,000, which was basically all that was left on the mortgage at the time. He valued the house at about $50,000 in 1905. Now keep in mind, in 1870, when this house was built, it cost $120,000. But we'd have to put those numbers into inflation calculators to figure out exactly what those amounts would equate to today. But I'm sure, that was still a lot of money in 1905. He talked about, in the newspaper article, it talked about Mr. Wells saying that if he couldn't sell the house right away, that he was going to actually build a 4-story apartment complex on the corner where the tennis courts were. But he ends up selling the house to the ladies' club. The apartment building never got built, and eventually, though, the ladies did sell off the side lot of the property. So we did end up losing it eventually. There was a gas station over there for a long time. And then there was a donut shop there, but today it's just a parking lot now. So we're kind of landlocked between parking lots. If you go on Google Earth and look at the mansion, you'll see we're surrounded by concrete jungle, where we would have once been surrounded by more mansions and beautiful lawns and gardens. So the times have changed. So we have a little bit of time left. Like I said, I do want to read the letter that Serena Truman wrote to the Monday Afternoon Club. You can get a really good idea of the Trumans' time here in the house. So I guess we'll go upstairs for a minute, since we have a little bit of time, and just take a peek upstairs for a second. I didn't turn any lights on up here because I wasn't initially planning on going, but Rosemary, that's awesome. I'm so happy that we could help. I found quite a bit of information on Ancestry. That's where I got the pictures of the Trumans from. There's census records. Serena's passport is there. There were a couple other documents too, but mostly census records, which are interesting to look at nonetheless. This is the master bedroom. I'm just gonna walk around for a minute so I can find a place to set the tripod down, and then I'll read you Serena's letter. Again, thanks for tuning in. Looks like the rain has stopped and we're in for some good weather for the rest of the weekend, so that's always good. So we're upstairs in the upstairs hall here now. So I won't read the whole letter. She wrote a pretty lengthy letter, but I'll just point out some highlights from the letter. So she talks about in the letter her father acquiring the home after George Harry Lester. She said that the house had always been known as the Phelps Mansion. They moved into it from what she describes as a lovely old white house in the suburbs, which had a lot of acreage. But Karen, the Trumans lived in the house from about 1889 to roughly 1904 or so. So not terribly long, 15 years, but long enough to make it their own for a short time that they were here. She says when they bought the house, in this letter she says that they lived in it from spring of 1890 to around the spring of 1905. And that's when they moved to the suburbs. She said that they did it with great reluctance because they loved their home here on Court Street and the lifelong friends that they had made in Binghamton. Like I mentioned earlier, Mr. Truman passed away in March of 1906 after moving to Yonkers. She says in the letter that we did not entertain in a large way, but back then people called on each other more in those days than they do now. Her brother, Cleveland, had developed a tennis court, which I mentioned, and the tennis courts were still here even after he was married. Let's see. And it says that he was actually working with his father and in Yonkers when they were doing real estate developments down there. So she says there were no weddings held in this home. However, many small parties for her mother's club of friends and her father's friends as well. She also says that her friends were entertained here quite a bit. And later on, she was a member of the Theta Sigma sorority. And so she would have her sorority friends here entertaining in the house as well. She talks about how they used to have picnics outside near the tennis courts, under the beautiful linden trees that were on the spacious lawn at the rear of the house, where the circular driveway was. She notes in 1962 that it's a pity that you do not, as a club, still own all of the property which the mansion needed. She asked what happened to the fountain that was in the front of the house. And she also asked what happened to the beautiful urn that was out in front of the house as well. She makes note that they always kept the urn filled through the summer and autumn with beautiful, appropriate flowers for the season. She says, later on, she says, perhaps I should not ask so many questions, but she states, we always enjoyed, while living here, keeping the conservatory filled with plants, and it added to the attractiveness of the beautiful dining room. She goes on to say as well that during the Trumans' time here at the house, the majority of it was happy times. The only time that there was great sadness in the house was when her brother Cleveland had passed away in 1894. But she says the memories of her family and her brother stay here in the house were precious ones to remember, and that she would love to return to the mansion whenever she can. Later on, she talks about her marriage a little bit, which we talked about. She says that she hopes she's helped answer some of the questions that the Monday Afternoon Club had been asking of her. She mentions that she can't really tell them where the beautiful chandelier was purchased, but she says that she knows that much of the beautiful woodwork in the house came from abroad. She talks about her schooling days. She attended the Lady Jane's Grey School, which by that point had been long gone, but she attended that school as a little girl, and then later she attended public school as well. So that's a little bit about the letter that she wrote to the club in 1962. But it gives you a good appreciation of the Trumans' time here in the house. So it's a great piece to have and keep safe. I don't know if we have any questions. We're about 40 to 45 minutes into the presentation. We try to keep them to an hour or less. But I can actually show you, let me just go grab the light here real quick before I do that. I can show you a picture of the mansion with its grounds. And it's believed that the people standing in the photo may have been the Trumans when the picture was taken, because it was taken in 1894. There you can see the house. Sorry about the glare from the window there. But you can see the houses next door, the fountain in the front there, just behind the gentleman. It's really hard to see, but here's the carriage house, or not the carriage house, the porte cochere, the covered drive, which is now on the side of the house. The carriage house would have been back over here, off to the side. So you'd have this big looping driveway that would come around behind the house. And so this past Thursday, we actually posted an old postcard that we found that shows a really good view of the entire street. So if you go back a couple days, you can see that posting and see all the old beautiful houses that once stood on the street here. Really gives you a good idea as to why in the 19th century Court Street was referred to as Mansion Row, because it was filled with very large, stately houses. In the museum's collection today, we have a lot of Isaac Perry items. We talked about Isaac Perry a couple of weeks ago. So you can see these are some clothing from Isaac Perry's granddaughter, Lucretia, when she was a little girl. It's kind of hard to get a really good shot of them when they're behind the glass. But we also have we have a lot of old older clothing, older dresses, ladies' accessories, mostly from the Monday Afternoon Club ladies of long ago in our collection that are brought out from time to time. We call this room the historical room. It's basically used as a room to, when we have exhibits, we kind of use this room as an extension of exhibit space. So, and if you've been on a tour before, you probably recognize this room. The rooms connect here by way of door to the room next door. This door here to the right is a closet. And so right here behind this glass case is where the staircase used to go all the way up to the 3rd floor. So you would go to the billiards room at the top of the stairs there. And the ceiling would have went up about 20 more feet to a skylight up there. So, but if you watched the behind the scenes tour a couple weeks ago, you know that the 3rd floor was taken off in 1941 because of water damage. And at that point, the interior staircase was removed too. So today the stairs are no longer there. This is our classroom / meeting room. We have a couple different things on display in here, mostly related to Binghamton history. But there's a great old map here from about 1893? Oh no. No, I'm sorry, 1873 map. You can see the 2 rivers, the Shenango and Susquehanna River. Right here is the Shenango Canal that went all the way to Utica and connected to the Erie Canal. But of course, you know, in 1848, the train started arriving, so the canal went away. Today it's known as State Street. So if you're driving on State Street, you're driving on top of the old canal. You may have noticed in the room here and the room next door that the fireplaces have windows over the tops. The chimney's split there to allow for the windows to be placed there. We have the dollhouse there because with the window there it lets light in so you can see inside the dollhouse, which is pretty cool. It's an old dollhouse from the Saturday Evening Post Memories of Christmas collection. And here's a picture of the house when the 3rd floor came down. And then, of course, there's a picture of it with the 3rd floor. So, pretty big difference. Now, today the house looks like this again because in 2002, money was raised to replicate the facade of the 3rd story, but that's really all it is. This used to be a bathroom, but we have an elevator today. The building is ADA compliant, so we can have guests come to the 2nd floor. It's really dark down here. This is the back stair hall. Back stairwells here. I don't know if you guys can see that. That's a picture. Turn the light on there. There we go. Those are back stairs. I don't want to hang my phone too far over because I don't want to drop it, but you can see the stairs there. So, kind of cool. Down the end of the hall there to the right, that doorway that's kind of popped open, that's the stairs to the 3rd floor. The dumbwaiter would have come up behind this door here, so things could be shipped up from the kitchen, which was in the basement, to the 3rd level of the house. So does anybody have any questions or anything else they want to see while I have the camera still on here in the mansion? Otherwise, we'll kind of wrap up our discussion about the Trumans. It was really interesting to learn more about them. It's kind of exciting to find pictures of some of the family. Unfortunately, I couldn't find pictures of the sons anywhere. Actually, there was one picture that may have existed, but it was on Ancestry, and I had to contact the owner of the picture to see if they would send it to me, but I don't know if they got my message or not because I never heard back from them. So it'd be nice if they did though, because then we could add that picture to the picture of the family that we have as well. So again, right now the museum is closed. to the public. We are phase 4, so we are anticipating opening around the end of June or the first week of July. Of course, we've been busy working on how that's going to work, and we'll communicate all of that stuff out to you, to our visitors, as we get closer to a reopening date. In the meantime, we'll continue doing these Facebook tours. Sue, the ladies paid $15,000 to buy the house in 1905. Again, the original asking price of the house was about $25,000. Mr. Wells gave them $10,000, so they bought the house for $15,000, which is a pretty good deal, I think. And then immediately after buying the house, they attached a large ballroom to the back of the house, and where our gift shop and new restrooms are today is an addition that was put on around 2002. So, okay, I attached a link to the chat here. If you enjoy these tours and you're able to make a donation or become a member, visit our website and consider doing that. If not, that's okay too. We appreciate you watching. We appreciate you learning right alongside with us. And we look forward to the day where we can open our building back up and have you come and visit us. So when that day comes, we'll be sure to let you know. Until then, get out, enjoy this beautiful weekend. Don't forget, Memorial Day weekend is a time to remember those who have given their lives for the freedoms that we enjoy today. Visit an old cemetery, take a picnic, have a cookout, but just whatever you do, do it safely. And we'll see you guys all back here next Saturday at 12 o'clock, where we're going to be talking about Colonel David Ireland and his connection to the Phelps family. And we'll be doing that not from the mansion, but from a different location. So be sure to tune in next week to catch us there. All right, guys. Until next time, we'll see you later.